The Old One stood at the center of the forum, and the light above him made his pale skin look like paper stretched too thin over ancient bones. His name was Vorath, and he had lived for 9,000 years. He had watched stars die. He had seen empires rise and crumble into dust. He had buried friends and enemies alike, and forgotten most of their names. But there was one memory he had never forgotten, one memory that still woke him in the dark hours of the night cycle, and left him shaking like a child. He had come to warn them. The Galactic Forum on Orin Prime was the largest gathering of intelligent species in known space. Representatives from over 400 civilizations sat in the tiered seats that rose like a bowl around the central platform. The air smelled of 100 different atmospheres mixed together by the station's filters. Lights floated above like tiny captured stars. It was beautiful and grand and very, very old. Vorath gripped the edge of the speaking platform and looked out at the faces watching him. Some looked bored. Some looked amused. A few were not looking at him at all. He began to speak. 9,000 years ago, he said, his voice thin but steady, I was a young officer in the Alari fleet. We were strong then. We believed we were the finest military force in the galaxy. We found a small species on the edge of settled space. They called themselves humans. They had only been traveling between stars for 100 years. Their ships were slow. Their weapons were crude. We looked at them and saw nothing worth fearing. He paused and his old eyes moved across the room. We were fools. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the chamber. In the upper tiers, the Dravosi delegation sat in their dark armor, their broad faces showing open amusement. Their leader, High Commander Ren, leaned back in his seat and whispered something to his advisor. The advisor, a thin creature named Palax, did not laugh. Vorath continued. We sent a war fleet to take one of their border colonies, a place called Keth 4. It was a mining world, nothing important. We sent 80 warships because we thought that was more than enough. The humans had 12 ships defending the colony. 12. He held up his trembling hands and spread his fingers. The battle lasted 6 hours. At the end of those 6 hours, every single one of our 80 ships was destroyed. Every one. The humans lost 2. The laughter faded. Not because anyone believed him, but because the silence felt appropriate for a moment before the jokes resumed. What I remember most, Vorath said, and now his voice dropped lower, is that they did not fight the way we expected. They did not charge. They did not roar or threaten or posture. They were quiet. They absorbed our first strikes without responding. We thought they were afraid. We thought they were freezing up. We pushed harder. We moved closer. And then when we were exactly where they wanted us to be, they struck. Once. With everything. It was not a battle. It was a lesson. Ren stood up from his seat. He was enormous, even for a Dravosi. His voice boomed across the chamber. Elder, with great respect for your age, your story is ancient history. The Alari fleet of 9,000 years ago was primitive even by the standards of that era. Humanity won a skirmish against outdated ships. This does not make them a threat. Vorath looked at Ren for a long time. High Commander, he said softly. That was their restrained response. They were holding back. I know this because after the battle, they sent a single message to our command. The message said, we hope this matter is resolved. We prefer peace. They had just destroyed 80 warships, and they called it a matter. They preferred peace. Ren smiled. It was not a kind smile, and I prefer action. The Dominion intends to expand into the Haydam Corridor. 3 systems currently under human protection, mining colonies, barely populated. We will take them within the cycle. The chamber buzzed with murmurs. In the far corner, the human delegation sat in their small section. There were only 4 of them. The galaxy had never given humanity more than a minor seat. They were considered young, unremarkable and not worth much attention. One of them stood. Her name was Hana. She was not tall, she was not loud. She wore a simple dark uniform, and her black hair was pulled back from her face. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear and carried easily across the chamber without any effort at all. "The United Earth government formally protests this planned incursion," she said. "The Haydam systems are under our protection. Their people are our people. Any military action against these systems will be considered an act of war." She paused and looked directly at Ren. "This is not a negotiation. This is a statement. I ask you, respectfully, to reconsider." Ren stared at her for a moment, then turned away with a wave of his massive hand. "Noted," he said, and the Dravosi delegation laughed again. The forum moved on to other business. Trade disputes, resource allocations, the usual machinery of galactic politics grinding forward. Vorath was escorted from the platform. Nobody stopped to speak with him. Nobody thanked him for his testimony. He walked slowly through the corridors of Orin Prime, his old legs aching, and he thought about the 80 ships burning in the dark above Keth 4. On the other side of the station, Palak sat alone in his quarters. He had pulled up old intelligence files, classified ones, reports that the Dravosi military had buried decades ago because they did not fit the narrative that humanity was weak. His hands were shaking as he scrolled through the data. The numbers did not make sense. The kill ratios were impossible. The response times were inhuman. He thought about telling Ren. He thought about it for a long time. Then he closed the files and told himself it would be fine. That night, Hana sat in the human delegation's small office and typed a single coded message. She sent it across the stars to Earth, to a building overlooking a dark ocean on a continent called Asia. The message contained 3 words. They did not listen. On Earth, a man named Teho read the message. He was sitting at his desk in the quiet hours of the night. The stars were visible through his window, sharp and cold against the black. He was not a large man. He did not look like a warrior. He looked like a professor or a poet. But he was the Fleet Admiral of the United Earth Naval Command, and when he read those 3 words, his expression did not change at all. He turned to the woman standing behind him. Her name was Yuna, and she had been waiting in silence. "Begin Phase 1, he said. Yuna nodded and left the room without a word. Teho looked back at the stars. Somewhere out there, a fleet of over 1,000 warships was preparing to take what belonged to his people. He picked up his tea and took a slow sip. He had all the time in the world. The Dravosi 3rd Expeditionary Fleet jumped into the Haydam Corridor on a Tuesday by Earth's calendar. It was 1,200 warships arranged in a standard conquest formation, a wall of dark metal and glowing engines that stretched across the void like a slow-moving storm. At its center flew the flagship, a massive dreadnought called the Iron Verdict, and on its bridge stood High Commander Ren with his arms folded across his chest and a satisfied look on his broad face. He expected resistance, a few patrol ships perhaps, maybe a defensive station or 2, something small and desperate that he could crush quickly and broadcast to the forum as proof of human weakness. What he found was nothing. Haydam 7 was the first system they entered. It was supposed to be a mining colony, 40,000 humans living and working on the rocky surface of a cold gray world. There should have been orbital stations, cargo ships, communication satellites, and defense platforms. There was nothing. The planet was dark. The stations were empty shells with their power cores removed. The docking rings floated in silence. No ships attached, no lights blinking. The surface was bare. Every building had been stripped clean. Every vehicle was gone. Every person had vanished. Ren stood on his bridge and stared at the sensor readings. His officers exchanged confused looks. Palax, standing 2 steps behind Ren as always, felt something cold settle in his stomach. "They abandoned it," Ren said. He sounded almost disappointed. "The humans ran." "High Commander," Palax said carefully, "an evacuation of this scale would have taken weeks, perhaps months. They began preparing long before we announced our intentions." Ren turned and looked at him. "So they are cowards who plan ahead. What difference does it make?" Palax opened his mouth to say something more, then closed it. He did not have the words for the feeling growing inside him. It was not quite fear. It was the feeling of walking through a forest that had gone suddenly and completely silent. The fleet moved to Hadam 9. The same thing. Empty, dark, every trace of human presence removed with careful, methodical precision. Not a scrap of food left behind. Not a forgotten tool. Not a single strand of hair. It was as if humans had never been there at all. Some of the junior officers began whispering among themselves. One of them, a young weapons officer, said what several were thinking. "This does not feel like retreat. This feels like cleaning." His superior told him to be quiet. The fleet pressed on to the 3rd system, Sori Outpost. It was smaller than the others, a deep space station used for long-range communication and refueling. When they arrived, they finally found something. A single relay beacon floated in the empty space where the station should have been. It was small, no larger than a cargo container, and it was broadcasting on every known frequency in every known galactic language. The message repeated in a continuous loop. "You were warned. This is your last chance to leave." Ren listened to it once, then he laughed, loud and sharp, and the sound echoed across the silent bridge. "Destroy it," he said. A gunner fired a single shot, and the beacon burst into a brief flash of light. And then there was nothing left but drifting fragments and silence. Palax had moved to the sensor station. He was running deep scans of the surrounding space, pushing the equipment harder than it was designed to go. The readings made no sense. There were faint signatures out there in the dark, ghost echoes that appeared on the sensors for a fraction of a second, and then vanished. They were too brief to identify, too scattered to track, but there were many of them. "High Commander," Palax said, and he hated how thin his voice sounded. "I am detecting anomalies in the surrounding sectors, faint energy signatures. They could be sensor errors, but their pattern is consistent with what?" Ren asked, not looking at him. Palax swallowed. "With a large number of ships running at minimal power." Ren finally turned. His eyes were hard and flat. "You are telling me that the species that just abandoned 3 systems without a fight has a hidden fleet waiting to attack us?" "I am telling you what the sensors show, High Commander." "Your sensors are malfunctioning. Have them recalibrated." Ren turned back to the viewport. "We take the systems. We plant our flag. We begin mining operations immediately. The Dominion Senate wants results, not ghost stories." Palax returned to his station. The ghost signatures were still there, flickering in and out like candle flames in a dark room. He saved the data to a private file and said nothing more. 3 days later, the Dravosi flag flew over Hadam 7. Mining equipment was deployed. Troops were stationed on the surface. The fleet settled into defensive positions around the 3 systems. And Ren sent a triumphant message to the Galactic Forum announcing the successful annexation of human territory. 1,200 warships, 3 systems, not a single shot fired in opposition. Ren believed he had won. Far away, hidden in a nebula whose clouds of gas and dust swallowed light and sensor signals alike, the human carrier Baiko drifted in perfect silence. It was enormous. A flat, dark shape bristling with launch bays and antenna arrays. And it was surrounded by dozens of smaller warships, arranged in neat formation, like sleeping wolves. On the bridge, Tejo stood before a holographic display that showed the Hadam corridor in pale blue light. The Dravosi fleet, appeared as a cluster of red dots, bright and dense and confident. He studied them the way a surgeon studies an image before making the first cut. Yuna stood beside him, a tablet in her hands, scrolling through data streams. "All civilian populations evacuated successfully," she said. "0 casualties. The last transport cleared the corridor 18 days ago." "Good," Taeho said. In the launch bay below the bridge, a young pilot named Sunwoo sat on the wing of his fighter and cleaned his helmet visor with his sleeve. He was 26 years old, and he had been flying combat ships since he was 19. He was good at it. He knew he was good at it. The waiting was the part he hated. His wingmate, a woman named Jiun, leaned against the landing strut beside him. "How long do we sit here?" she asked. "Until the Admiral says go," Sunwoo replied. "And when will that be?" Jiun pressed. Sunwoo looked toward the ceiling, as if he could see through the metal and the void and the nebula, all the way to where the Dravosi fleet was settling in and feeling comfortable and safe. "When they stop being afraid," he said. "When they start unpacking. When they put their feet up and pour themselves a drink and forget that we exist. That is when we go." Jiun was quiet for a moment. "That is terrifying." Sunwoo grinned. "That is the Admiral." On the bridge, Yuna looked at Taeho. "They are establishing permanent installations on Haydam 7. Mining has begun. Their fleet is transitioning from combat formation to standard occupation posture." Taeho nodded slowly. "Let them settle in. Let them feel safe. Let them believe we are gone. And then?" Taeho did not answer. He did not need to. In a quiet room on a different world, the old war historian Do-hyun sat at his desk and wrote the opening lines of what would become the most widely read military history in galactic record. His pen moved slowly across the paper. "The galaxy would later call it the Haydam Silence," he wrote. "3 systems went dark, and every species that watched assumed it was surrender. They did not understand. They could not understand. The silence was not retreat. It was preparation. Humans do not run from their enemies. They set the table, they light the candles, and they wait for their guests to sit down. And then they lock the doors." 2 weeks passed, and the Dravosi made themselves comfortable in the Haydam corridor. Their engineers built permanent structures on the surface of Haydam 7. Their mining drills cut deep into the rock and began pulling out rare metals that the Dominion needed for its endless expansion. Supply ships came and went. Troops rotated through their shifts. The officers played card games in their quarters and talked about how easy this had been. Ren sent a second message to the Galactic Forum, longer and more boastful than the first. He described the annexation as a historic victory and invited other species to join the Dominion in what he called the taming of humanity. He said the humans had shown their true nature by running from a superior force. He said this was proof that the galaxy's youngest species did not deserve the territory it claimed. The message was broadcast across 400 systems. Everyone heard it. On a quiet station far from the Haydam corridor, Sovereign Lysic of the Nytheri Collective listened to Ren's message and felt uneasy. She was a careful leader, old enough to respect history, and wise enough to know that silence from an enemy was rarely good news. She had read Elder Vorath's testimony. She had studied it more carefully than anyone else on the forum, and the numbers in that ancient story kept her awake at night. She contacted Hana through a private, encrypted channel. "I need to know what is coming," Lysic said. Her voice was steady, but her 4 eyes blinked rapidly, a sign of deep anxiety in her species. Hana's face appeared on the screen, calm and polite as always. "Sovereign, I appreciate your concern. I cannot share military details with you, but I can offer a suggestion. Please, move your border fleets away from the Haydam corridor, as far as you can manage. Do it quietly, and do it soon. That is all I can tell you." Lisek stared at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and closed the channel. Within hours, every Nithari ship within range of the Hadam systems began pulling back. Lisek did not explain why. Her officers asked questions, and she told them it was a routine redeployment. None of them believed her, but none of them argued. Deep inside the nebula, aboard the Baiko, Tejo called a briefing. The room was plain, gray walls, a long metal table, and a holographic projector at its center. Yuna stood at the front. Behind her, the projector displayed a three-dimensional map of the Hadam corridor, with every Dravosi ship marked in red. Around the table sat the commanders of 4 separate human fleets, each one hidden in a different nebula surrounding the corridor. They had been in position for weeks, running silent, waiting. Phase 2, Yuna said. She did not waste time with introductions or speeches. She touched the display, and it shifted, showing lines of attack, timing sequences, and kill zones overlaid on the Dravosi positions. This is not a battle plan, she said. This is an extermination geometry. The room was very quiet. She walked them through it step by step. 4 fleets would strike simultaneously from 4 directions. The timing had to be perfect, down to the fraction of a second. If any fleet arrived too early, the Dravosi would scatter. If any arrived too late, the kill zone would have gaps. Precision was everything. The first element was the Vanguard. 40 fast attack ships would drop out of stealth directly in front of the Dravosi perimeter. Their job was not to fight. Their job was to provoke. The Dravosi military doctrine was well documented. When threatened from a single direction, they instinctively tightened their formation to concentrate firepower. This was what Yuna wanted. She needed them packed close together. The second element was the Geomon system. This was humanity's hidden weapon, a network of AI-guided kinetic lances mounted on platforms hidden in the debris fields around the Hadam systems. Each lance fired a dense metal projectile at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The projectiles were too small to detect on sensors and too fast to dodge. A single lance could punch clean through a capital ship's shields and hull. There were 300 lances in position. The third element was the 4 main fleets. Once the Geomon lances had torn through the compressed Dravosi formation, the fleets would emerge from the nebulae and close every possible escape route. No retreat corridors would be left open, no exit vectors, nothing. There will be no warning shots, Yuna said. No negotiation window, no mercy protocols. They were given a warning. They destroyed it. She was referring to the relay beacon at Sori Outpost. The rules of engagement are simple. Everything in the kill zone that is not broadcasting a human identification signal is a target. Sunwoo sat in the back of the room with his arms crossed. He had been assigned to lead the Vanguard, the 40 ships that would fly directly at 1,200 enemy warships and survive long enough to make them compress. It was, by any reasonable measure, a suicide mission. He had volunteered for it immediately. His wingmate, Jian, sat beside him. She had also volunteered. When he had asked her why, she had said, "Because someone has to, and I do not trust anyone else to keep up with you." After the briefing, the preparations began. They were methodical and mechanical. Engineers ran final checks on every system. Pilots walked through their flight paths again and again in simulation. Gunners calibrated their weapons with the kind of care usually reserved for surgical instruments. There was no excitement, no cheering, no battle cries. It looked more like a factory preparing for a production run than an army preparing for war. Tejo walked the corridors of the Beko that night. He stopped at the mess hall, where pilots and crew members sat eating in near silence. He stopped at the medical bay, where surgeons were laying out their tools. He stopped at the hangar, where Sunwoo was sitting on the floor beneath his fighter, staring at nothing. "Are you afraid?" Tejo asked. Sunwoo looked up. "No, sir." "Good. Fear makes you slow." Taeho paused. But do not be reckless either. I need you alive, Sunwoo. You and your people fly in. Make them angry. Make them compress, and then you fly out. Do not play hero. Do not chase kills. Just do the job. Yes, sir. Taeho nodded and walked away. Sunwoo watched him go, and thought that the admiral moved through the ship like a ghost. Quiet, calm, as if tomorrow was just another day. The next morning, Taeho stood on the bridge and addressed the fleet. His voice was carried to every ship across a secure channel. He spoke for less than a minute. They took what was ours. They were given a choice, and they chose wrong. We do not fight for glory. We do not fight for revenge. We fight because it is necessary, and because no one else will protect our people if we do not. Be precise. Be quick. Go home safe. That is all. The channel closed. In the silence that followed, hundreds of ships powered up their engines. Weapon systems came online. Navigation computers locked onto their targets. In the cockpits, and on the bridges, and in the gun turrets, thousands of human beings sat in the dark and waited for the word. Yuna stood at her station and watched the countdown. The numbers fell slowly, like drops of water from a faucet. She checked every fleet's position one final time. All 4 were exactly where they needed to be. The Geomoon platforms reported ready. The Vanguard was in launch position. She looked at Taeho. He was sitting in the command chair, with his hands resting on the armrests. His face showed nothing. No anger, no excitement, no doubt. He could have been sitting in a garden, watching the wind move through trees. The countdown reached 0. Taeho leaned forward slightly. Engage, he said. The Dravosi sensor officer on the perimeter cruiser Ashfall was the first to see them. 40 signatures appeared out of nowhere, burning hard and fast, heading straight for the center of the fleet. He stared at his screen for 2 full seconds before he could make his voice work. Contact. 40 enemy fighters, bearing 005, closing fast. On the bridge of the Iron Verdict, Ren received the report and felt a surge of satisfaction rather than alarm. 40 ships. The humans had sent 40 ships against 1,200. He almost admired the stupidity of it. All ships, Titan formation, he ordered. Concentrate forward batteries. Destroy them. The Dravosi fleet responded exactly as their training demanded. The outer ships pulled inward. The formation compressed like a fist closing, presenting a wall of overlapping firepower toward the incoming threat. It was what they had practiced 1,000 times. It was exactly what Yuna had predicted they would do. Sunwoo led the Vanguard straight into the wall of fire. Plasma bolts and particle beams filled the space ahead of him like a burning rain. His hands moved on the controls with a calm precision that did not match his heartbeat. He rolled left, dove under a beam that would have cut his ship in half, pulled up through a gap between 2 explosions, and kept flying forward. Stay tight, he said over the squadron channel. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. We are the bait. Make them chase us. Jian was on his wing, matching him move for move. Behind them, 38 other pilots threaded through the barrage like needles through fabric. 2 ships were hit in the first 30 seconds. Their signals vanished from the display without ceremony. Sunwoo felt the loss like a punch to his chest, but he did not slow down. The Vanguard screamed through the Dravosi formation, weaving between capital ships, drawing fire from every direction. The Dravosi kept compressing, turning inward to track the small, fast ships darting through their ranks. They were so focused on the 40 fighters in front of them that they did not notice what was happening in the dark around them. 90 seconds after the Vanguard launched, the Geomun lances fired. There was no sound. There was no flash. 300 kinetic projectiles, each one no larger than a human arm, launched from hidden platforms scattered across the debris fields of the Haydem system. They traveled at a speed that made light itself seem patient. They were too small for sensors to detect, and too fast for any defense system to track. They hit the compressed Dravosi fleet like invisible needles punching through paper. The first volley struck 300 ships simultaneously. The projectiles passed through shields as if they did not exist, punched through hull plating, through internal bulkheads, through engine cores, and out the other side. Some projectiles passed through 2 or 3 ships before their energy was spent. The effect was instantaneous. 300 Dravosi warships died in the same second, their hulls splitting open, their reactors detonating in brief silent flashes that lit up the void like a string of firecrackers. On the iron verdict, Ren felt his ship shudder as a lance punched through the vessel 3 decks below his feet. Alarms screamed. Damage reports flooded in. He looked at his tactical display and watched in disbelief as a quarter of his fleet simply disappeared. "What is happening?" he shouted. No one could answer him because no one understood what they were seeing. The weapons that hit them left no energy signature. There was no incoming fire on sensors. Ships were simply dying, torn apart by invisible forces. Before Ren could process the first volley, the 4 human fleets emerged from the nebulae. They came from every direction at once: north, south, east, west, the old Earth directions that human navigators still used out of habit. 4 fleets, each one a blade aimed at the heart of the Dravosi formation. They dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect synchronization, arriving within half a second of each other, and immediately began firing. The Dravosi fleet was surrounded. The formation that had compressed to destroy 40 fighters was now a dense, slow-moving target with enemies on every side and no room to maneuver. Ships collided with each other, trying to turn. Engines flared and died. Communication channels erupted into chaos as officers screamed orders that contradicted each other. Tejo watched it from the bridge of the Baiko. The holographic display showed the Dravosi fleet as a shrinking red mass surrounded by blue. Yuna called out numbers in a flat, steady voice. 400 destroyed, 500 destroyed, 600. There was no emotion in her voice. She could have been reading a weather report. Ren, desperate now, ordered a full retreat. His navigators searched for an escape vector, any direction where the human fleet was thin enough to break through. They found nothing. Yuna had studied every Dravosi retreat protocol from intercepted communications. She knew which directions they would try to run, and she had placed blocking forces on every single one. The Dravosi were in a box, a kill box, and the walls were closing in. Sunwoo and his remaining Vanguard ships had punched through the Dravosi formation and were now behind enemy lines. He saw the command ships, the big ones with the heavy armor and the communication arrays, and he understood what needed to happen. If the Dravosi fleet could coordinate, they might still organize a breakout. If their command ships went dark, they would fall apart. "Jian, on me," he said. "We are going for their command network." They dove back into the chaos, weaving through burning wreckage and panicking warships, and began hitting the command vessels one by one. Each command ship that went dark took 100 other ships out of coordination. The Dravosi fleet was dissolving from an organized military force into a scattered, terrified mob. Palax stood on the bridge of a communications ship at the very edge of the fleet. He had positioned himself there deliberately, as far from the center as possible, because some quiet part of his mind had known this was coming. He watched the tactical display, and he saw the end of the Dravosi 3rd Expeditionary Fleet happen in real time. He opened a channel to Ren. "High Commander, please, surrender. They will accept it. This is what they do. They offer one chance." Ren's face appeared on screen. His bridge was burning behind him. His armor was cracked. His eyes were wide and wild. "I will not surrender to animals," he spat. "Then we will all die here." Ren cut the channel. At the 4-minute mark, Tejo opened a broadcast on all frequencies. His voice was calm and clear, and carried no emotion at all. High Commander Ren. This is Fleet Admiral Teho of the United Earth Naval Command. Surrender your fleet. This is the only time I will offer. The channel stayed open. 30 seconds of silence. No response came. Teho closed the channel and nodded once to Yuna. The human fleets closed the final distance. The Geoman lances fired a second volley. The remaining Dravosi ships, broken and scattered and leaderless, were destroyed one by one with surgical precision. No wasted shots, no overkill. One ship, one kill, clean and fast and final. At the 6-minute mark, the last Dravosi warship went dark. 1,200 ships, 6 minutes. The humans had not lost a single capital ship. Sunwoo's Vanguard had lost 2 pilots. Their names were Minji and Kyungsoo. They were 24 and 27 years old. Teho stood on his bridge and read their names aloud. The entire crew stood in silence for 10 seconds. Then they returned to their stations and began the work of securing the Haydam corridor. Across the galaxy, on Orin Prime and 100 other stations and worlds, sensor arrays had picked up the battle in real time. Representatives of 400 species watched the data scroll across their screens. For 6 minutes, not a single voice was raised in the Galactic Forum. The chamber was silent in a way it had never been silent before. In the upper gallery, Elder Vorath sat alone in his seat. His old hands were folded in his lap. Tears ran down his thin face and dripped onto his robes. He was not crying for the Dravosi. He was crying because he had told them. He had stood in that very chamber and told them exactly what would happen. The galaxy did not sleep that night. On 400 worlds and thousands of stations and ships, the sensor data from the Haydam corridor was replayed again and again. Military analysts studied it. Politicians debated it. Ordinary citizens watched it on their screens and felt something shift inside their understanding of the universe. 1,200 warships, the pride of the largest military power in known space, erased in 6 minutes by a species that most of them had barely thought about. The Dravosi Dominion was in chaos. Ren was dead. The Third Expeditionary Fleet was gone. The Senate, which had cheered the annexation of the Haydam corridor just weeks ago, now turned on each other with accusations and blame. Some demanded revenge. Others demanded negotiations. A few demanded the heads of everyone who had supported the invasion in the first place. The noise was enormous and accomplished nothing. What frightened the galaxy most was not the battle itself. It was what happened after. Teho did not advance. The human fleet did not push into Dravosi space. There were no follow-up strikes, no occupation forces crossing the border, no demands for territory or tribute. The human ships simply moved back to the Haydam systems, reactivated the mining stations, and resumed operations as if the entire war had been a brief interruption in their schedule. Within a week, cargo ships were moving through the corridor again. Civilian transports returned the evacuated populations to their homes. The mining drills started turning. Life went on. This restraint terrified the galaxy far more than the violence had. A species capable of destroying 1,200 warships in 6 minutes had every reason to press its advantage. It could have marched straight to the Dravosi homeworld and made demands that would have humbled the Dominion for centuries. Instead, it simply went back to work. The message was clear without being spoken. Humanity did not want an empire. It did not want conquest. It just wanted to be left alone. And it was willing to do unspeakable things to anyone who refused to grant that wish. On Orin Prime, the Galactic Forum convened an emergency session. The chamber was full, but the usual noise and chaos were absent. Delegates spoke in hushed voices. Nobody laughed. Nobody postured. The mood was that of a funeral, where nobody was sure who had died. Hana entered the chamber and walked to the human delegation's small section in the far corner. The same minor seat, the same small space. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap, and said absolutely nothing. She did not need to make a speech. She did not need to gloat or threaten or demand a larger seat. Every eye in the room followed her as she walked, and when she sat, the silence deepened. Sovereign Lysic of the Netheri Collective rose and formally proposed an alliance with humanity. Her voice was steady, and her words were carefully chosen. She did not mention the battle. She spoke of shared values, mutual respect, and the desire for a stable and peaceful galaxy. But everyone understood what she was really saying. She was choosing a side, and she was choosing the side that had just demonstrated what happened when you chose wrong. Other neutral factions followed within days. The Pelori Federation, the Shimmering Accord, the small, quiet species that had spent centuries trying to avoid the attention of larger powers, now moved toward Earth with a speed that would have been amusing if the circumstances had been less grim. The Dravosi Dominion, humbled and leaderless, sent a delegation to Earth. They traveled in a diplomatic vessel, unarmed, broadcasting peace signals on every frequency. They were escorted through human space by 2 patrol ships and treated with courtesy at every checkpoint. Tejo received them personally in a meeting room overlooking the same dark ocean he watched from his office window. He wore a simple uniform. He offered them tea. He sat across the table from the Dravosi envoys and listened to their request for a formal ceasefire with the same calm, attentive expression he wore for everything. The ceasefire document was short. Tejo signed it without adding a single punitive clause. No demands for reparations, no forced disarmament, no territorial concessions beyond the return of the Hatem systems, which humanity already held. The lead Dravosi envoy, a senior diplomat named Threll, stared at the signed document and could not hide his confusion. "Admiral," he said, "you have every advantage. You could demand anything. Why do you ask for nothing?" Tejo set down his pen and looked at Threll with an expression that was not unkind. "Because we are not conquerors," he said. "We never wanted your territory. We never wanted your resources. We never wanted your submission. We simply do not allow others to take what is ours. That is the beginning and the end of it. Go home, rebuild, and please, do not make us do this again." Threll nodded slowly. He gathered the documents and left. He did not look back. Palax survived the battle. He had been on a communications ship at the far edge of the fleet, close enough to escape when the formation collapsed. He was one of fewer than 100 Dravosi who made it out of the Hatem corridor alive, not because of his competence, but because almost every officer senior to him was dead. He became the Dominion's new chief military advisor, and his first act was to institute a single, absolute rule that was carved into the wall of every Dravosi military academy and printed on the first page of every tactical manual. The rule was simple. 3 words: never engage humanity. When younger officers asked him why, Palax would tell them about the ghost signatures he had detected in the nebulae. He would tell them about the relay beacon and its warning. He would tell them about the 6 minutes, and then he would lean forward and say, very quietly, "They told us what would happen. They told us exactly, and we did not listen. That is the only mistake you need to avoid. When a human tells you something, believe them." On Orin Prime, weeks after the battle, Hana visited Elder Vorath in his quarters. They were small rooms, simple, with a view of the stars through a curved window. Vorath was sitting in a chair, wrapped in a blanket, looking even older than he had on the day he addressed the forum. Hana brought him tea, earth tea. He held the cup in both hands and breathed in the steam. "I have lived for 9,000 years, he said. "I have seen 100 wars. I have watched species rise and fall and rise again. I have studied every kind of warrior the galaxy has produced. But I have never seen anything like your people." Hana sat across from him and listened. Most species fight with anger, Vorath continued, or with fear, or with pride. Your people fight with none of these things. You fight with patience and precision and a kind of calm resolve that I can only describe as terrifying. You gave them every chance, every warning, and when they refused to listen, you did not hesitate. Not for a moment. What are you? Hana smiled. It was a small, gentle smile, the kind that reached her eyes and softened her whole face. We are what happens, she said, when you push something that asked you, politely, to stop. Vorath held her gaze for a long time. Then he nodded and sipped his tea. Sunwoo was promoted to squadron leader after the battle. Command offered him a desk position, a comfortable office, and a title with the word senior in it. He declined. He returned to border patrol duty in the Haydam corridor, flying the same route he had flown before the war, in a new fighter with the names Minji and Kyung-soo painted on the side. A journalist tracked him down for an interview and asked him if he considered himself a hero. Sunwoo shrugged and scratched the back of his neck. I am a pilot, he said. I flew where they told me to fly. I shot what they told me to shoot. I am not the scary one. The scary one is Admiral Taeho. That man drinks his tea and reads poetry while planning the end of empires. If you want a hero, go talk to him. But he will probably just offer you tea and change the subject. On Earth, Do-hyun finished the last chapter of his book. He had titled it The Haydam Record, and it would go on to be translated into every galactic language and read by every species with the ability to read. The final passage was the one that would be quoted most often in the centuries to come. He wrote it late at night, by the light of a single lamp, with the sound of rain against his window. The elder spoke, he wrote. He stood before 400 species and told them what humanity was. He told them about the burning of Keth 4 and the patience of a species that does not threaten, does not posture, and does not warn twice. The galaxy laughed. They called him old and foolish and afraid of shadows. And then, in 6 minutes of fire and silence, they learned the truth. Humanity does not make threats. They make promises. And they always, always keep them. Remember this. Remember it well. Because if you forget, they will remind you, and you will not enjoy the lesson. He set down his pen and looked out the window at the rain falling on the dark city below. Somewhere above the clouds, the stars were shining, and out there, among those stars, the galaxy was very, very quiet.